Hi everyone, this is Jeffrey, JGB146 Blake from Grinderschool.com, a small stakes poker training site, and we're partnering with WSOP.com to bring you some poker training videos. Today we're going to start things off with a little discussion about the continuation bet. So, for those not familiar, a continuation bet is a bet that you make post-flop that is almost independent of your hand, and it's based more on trying to get folds when your opponent doesn't have anything. Usually it represents a hand that is less than top pair, because if you have top pair or better, you're probably betting for value more than just making a continuation bet. So the factors that you need to consider when deciding whether or not to make a continuation bet, or a C bet for short, you need to consider the texture of the board. So that means when the flop comes out, if there's a lot of ways that that board is going to have hit the types of hands that your opponent is playing, then you probably don't want to continuation bet. This gets into the concept of wet boards and dry boards. So wet boards are boards that contain lots of connected cards, flush cards, that sort of thing. Also, hands that contain lots of face cards, because, well, A, they're going to have some connection there, but B, your opponents are more likely to have held on to a face card pre-flop than not. So any board that contains a whole lot of face cards is likely to have an opponent more likely to play back at it. So the types of boards that are ideal here are rainbow boards, boards with 3 different suits that also have, say, one face card and then 2 little cards. So like a King 7-3 board. That would be great, especially if it had 3 different suits. And sort of tied into that is that we're looking for opponents who are going to play potentially a lot of hands pre-flop, but then let go if they don't hit the flop. Even players who don't play a lot of hands pre-flop, if they let go when they don't hit the flop, are good candidates to c-bet against. And I guess this leads into our second point here, that our second consideration is the number or type of opponents. So type of opponent, we prefer the people who are going to give up post-flop as opposed to the guys who are going to stick around with any pair and any draw. And sometimes, ace high trying to call you down. We also prefer to be c-betting against a single opponent. When you're against multiple opponents, there's just a much higher chance that someone has hit something post-flop that'll get them to continue in the hand. There's more combinations out there, obviously, more ways that someone can have picked something up. So betting is essentially a pure bluff is less effective. Now the third consideration that we're wanting to look at is if we have equity in the hand. So, we said we were doing this as a pure bluff, but maybe you have 2 flush cards and one of your suit is out there on the board. What that's going to mean is that you have a little bit of equity. Maybe you have a gut shot straight draw, right? So you don't have enough value to really bet in the hand looking for calls, but you do have some backup if you get called. Those types of situations are much better to make a c-bet than situations where you don't have anything at all. Obviously, you can make your hand later on, and that can be helpful. So if you have some equity in the hand, you might be able to c-bet with more opponents, or opponents who are going to call you down a little bit lighter, or on boards that are otherwise worse to c-bet. Another consideration is whether or not we have showdown value. So this is a little bit different than the previous things, because previously we were talking about reasons to c-bet, and really showdown value is a reason not to c-bet. So if we have a hand that potentially could win at showdown without any improvement, we may be more inclined to go ahead and not c-bet, to just check and try to get to that showdown cheaply. We want to let our hand stand on its own strength. So this could be kind of middle pairs, pairs that are below the top pair, but are large enough, hopefully, to not be counterfeited a lot. So, like a pocket jacks on a queen high board, you might skip the c-bet there. You might decide that you're going to play just for the value of your jacks, especially if you're in position, you don't have that far to go. On the other hand, if you have a really small pair, like say pocket fours on a king high board, well, there's going to be a lot of cards that could come, so that if you give your opponent the chance, they could improve, even though you have some value now, they could improve and end up beating you. So you might want to c-bet those really low pairs, even though you technically have some showdown value. Now, there are also some secondary considerations that we can take into account, and these basically apply when we're kind of on the fence with all of the key considerations. These can sort of break a tie when you're like, well, I'm not sure if I should make a bet here or not. So if we have barrel potential, so that means hands where we could potentially bet again. There are a lot of turn cards that are going to be scary to our opponent, and we have an opponent that's going to fold to a lot of scary turn cards. Again, this I guess kind of feeds into the type of opponent we're facing. But if we're gonna be able to bet again on a future street and get them to fold, then it makes sense to continuation bet. If stack sizes are such that our opponents are more likely to just get all their chips in. So again, this is a little bit opponent dependent, but generally speaking, people with short stacks are going to get all their chips in more readily. So we might want to skip c-bets unless we have enough equity or we have some solid showdown value. We might want to skip those c-bets against short stacks. And then the third factor is protection. So if there are a lot of ways that an opponent with a worse hand can have some equity against us, sometimes we want to bet to protect our current equity in the pot. So, say we have an opponent that has a flush draw, and we have just a random pair. Well, they may have 30% or more equity in the pot against us, and by betting, instead of us having 70% equity, if they fold, we obviously have 100% equity and take the whole pot down. We may not have a strong enough hand to bet just on the value of the hand, but in order to get our opponents to fold hands where they have equity against us, it might make sense to bet for protection reasons if everything else is kind of a wash. Now, the final thing we want to talk about are some reasons that we might skip making a c-bet. So basically, the spots that you want to skip c-bet, we've sort of talked about them already. If we're in a flop, then there's a bad board texture. So lots of connected cards, lots of suited cards, basically boards that are going to hit our opponent's range frequently, we just should skip it. If there's too many opponents in the hand, we want to skip the c-bet because, again, someone is probably going to have made a hand there. If the opponent or opponents that we are facing are either a calling station or a maniac, meaning that they're going to just call down with all kinds of hands, or they're going to raise us with all kinds of hands. Well, either of those situations, you don't want to c-bet as often. That's not meaning to say that you'll never c-bet, but you tend to c-bet less often. If we have showdown value, again, looking to just capitalize on the strength of our hand if it's not going to be counterfeited very easily. And then the final factor is pot control. This we haven't really touched on in any of the other points. So this is worth spending a minute talking about. Pot control basically means, maybe we have a decent hand, but it's not a hand that we want to get into a big pot with. So we may want to skip the c-bet just to keep that pot to a reasonable size. So this is a sort of situation where you don't really want to be, playing a huge pot with just bottom pair. That type of situation might lead you to skip a c-bet or to size your c-bet differently when appropriate. Now we'll look at a few hands that highlight the continuation bet considerations. Okay, so here with ace-7, heads up pot, ace-7 suited, we go ahead and raise pre-flop. And the flop comes down. It's a jack-9-4 flop, and our opponent checks to us. We're heads up. This is a board that you have the connectedness from the jack and the 9. Lots of 10s get played, 10-8, queen 10, even king 10 types of hands could play there. So it's a little connected, but because we're heads up, that makes it safer than normal, and it's all three different suits, so that's not going to cause him to call as often. So this is a good spot to go ahead and make a continuation bet. We do make one, and he folds. That's perfect. Okay, so here we're raising pre-flop with pocket fives from the button. We get a fold, and we get one call. The board comes down, and it is three of a suit, and it's connected. So that's a little bit of a count against the board texture. We do happen to have one of those suits. We have our pair, but our pair isn't really going to have much showdown value at this point. We obviously also have the straight potential, and basically this is a spot where our equity is going to be good, and really for our opponent to have anything other than the flush draw here, he's going to, the straight draws all are reliant on our hand. He can't have very many fives because we've got a lot of them. We have half of them. So for that reason, even though it looks super connected, it's not likely to have hit his hand. And the ace is also likely to have hit our raising range more than his calling range. So we're going to go ahead and make a bet here. We do have some equity in the, we do potentially have a way to make a flush if he doesn't have a bigger flush. He obviously doesn't know how big or small our flush would be. So that's going to potentially mean that he could fold more often. We have that equity from the potential straight if he doesn't already have a flush, and we'll find out very quickly if he does already have the flush. So this is a good one to go ahead and make a c-bet again. We do, and he folds. It works. Okay, so here we're in late position with pocket sevens. Again, a good spot to raise, and we get one caller. So the board comes down, it's 10 high, there are two diamonds, but there's not a lot of connectedness there, and we have good potential for the best hand, but it's a hand where a lot of cards could come to counterfeit that. So we want to go ahead and bet here for a combination of value and making the c-bet. A lot of times we're ahead, but we don't want him to see another card and realize, if he has two overcards, that extra card that he can see, if we give that to him for free, he's realizing some of his equity. This goes back to some of the protection factors where you can kind of go either way, but if he's got king queen, we don't want to give him a free shot to get that queen. We want to at least make him pay for it, and if we can just take this down, we're fine with that because our hand isn't really strong enough that we want to let him continue. So again, we go ahead and bet, and he folds. That works out fine for us. We're happy with that. Okay, so here, late position with just a king random kicker. That's fine. We get one caller, and the board comes down, and it's an ace jack 2. So there's some connectedness here. There's obviously suitedness. In a lot of ways, this wouldn't be a great board to make a bet on. However, we have some history with this opponent, and he tends to be the type of opponent that is either going to connect solidly with the board and stick around, or just go away. He doesn't play a whole lot of draws. He doesn't want to pay a lot if he's drawing. So here, we're making a continuation bet because the ace hits our range, and our opponent is leading us to say, well, he plays a little bit more kind of fit or fold post flop, and that's going to lead us to bet more often. So that's the reason we're betting here. It works out, and he goes away. Again, against a lot of opponents, this is not the type of board that you would want to make a c-bet on. However, this specific opponent, it made sense. So here we're getting a little bit fancy pre-flop. We have an opponent that has been limping a lot of our blinds. He's getting a free look at the flop, and we sort of want to stop that from happening. This is a spot where it can make sense to take a bet with a junky hand that you don't really want to play post-flop, just to kind of shut them down. Obviously, if we had if we had a stronger hand, it makes even more sense. But here, I just sort of want to shut him down, want to keep him from limping our blinds every time, and maybe encourage a few folds here and there. So we went ahead and raised. He does call, and the board comes down. It's a king and two suited kind of connected cards. So not great because It has connectedness. It has, the suitedness. We do have one of those suits, so we have that little bit of backdoor equity. Um, and then it does have the king high aspect that is going to look like it might hit our range for raising more than it hits his range for limp calling. So he checks to us. We're going to go ahead and make a continuation bet here. If we knew he was the type of player to limp and call with a lot of suited connectors and maybe not as many other hands, then we might skip it here. But just since we know that he does do it with a wide range of hands based on our previous history with him, we know that there's going to be a lot of hands here. Even though this is a fairly connected board, there's going to be a lot of stuff that he has in his very wide range that don't hit here. And we have the backdoor equity for the flush or for a straight. Again, nothing that gives us actual value in the hand, but it gives us potential to improve later, to potentially barrel again, because if like a seven of clubs came, that would obviously be the Yahtzee card for us, because suddenly we have a very strong draw. Well, that barreling potential is enough, I think, to push us over the edge and justify a continuation bet here. We go ahead and bet, and he does fold. Okay, so here we have ace king. We're out of position. We're in the small blind, and we have a couple of people already in the pot. So this is a spot where we want to go ahead and we want to raise, make a large raise. We're going to be out of position throughout the hand, and we don't want people to see the board cheaply. So we go ahead and make a pretty sizable raise to $5, and we get one caller. It happens to be the short stack who was blinded in preflop. That's sort of ideal for us. Ace King could actually be well ahead of his calling range unless he hits a strong flop. So it might even be a spot that we could win unimproved, but it's not a spot that we're going to want to let him continue cheaply. So the flop comes down and it's a queen, two kind of raggedy cards. There is a suit there, and it's us first stacked. We go ahead and we bet out. We bet out strongly. Again, we are sort of willing to commit ourselves against his range because he is so wide. Now, most of the time when he continues, he's probably going to have us beat, but we have a fair amount of equity in that we can hit our overcards. We can hit that backdoor runner straight, and a lot of times he may commit, with draws, with a spade flush draw, with sort of a gut shot straight draw, and most of the time he's going to go away. We're obviously happy for him to go away, but since we know, we're looking at stack sizes, and we want to consider what we're going to do if he is going to shove in the hand. Well, we sort of declare what we're going to do by putting half of his stack out there. He's not going to shove as a bluff to try to get us off the hand and sort of force us to make a tough decision. It'll be an easy decision to call if he shoves here. So all of those things combined together sort of justify making the bet, and then also justify the amount that we're betting to sort of indicate that we're not going away. He folds, it works out, and we're happy. Okay, so here's a spot where we're in the big blind with a king jack. Our opponent, it folds all the way around to the small blind, and he limps. So king jack, we're ultimately, even though we're in the big blind, we're going to be in position throughout the rest of the hand. That makes the hand stronger. We go ahead, we raise, heads up. King jack is a strong enough hand to play. So we raise mostly for value, really, and our opponent calls. So the board comes down, and it is a queen 10 with suit. This is a spot where if we had nothing on the board, we would want to skip a c-bet here. It's very connected. Lots of face cards are going to want to continue here. There's the suitedness that works against a pure c-bet. However, we have one of those suits, so that reduces his range of having decent flushes a little bit, because a lot of the hands that he would play for flush value would be like an ace jack suited, a king jack suited, a jack 9 suited, those types of hands. So he's going to have fewer flushes here than he might otherwise. Now, sure, there's going to be some, but we also have the straight potential that gives us some extra value in the hand. So even though this board is really kind of junky for c-betting, it combines with our hand and we get enough equity to justify making a c-bet. We don't have any showdown value, and this is a spot, this is ideal for us to make a bet. So we go ahead and do so sort of as a semi-bluff. He calls and then checks to us on the turn. Well, the turn completes our hand, and you could almost justify slowing down now that we have a lot of showdown value. But he could still have, that flush draw with the clubs. He could potentially have had a random hand that he came along with and now has a flush draw with the diamonds, although that's very unlikely. But ultimately, there's too many ways that things could continue to go wrong, and ultimately, we want to get value for our straight now if we can. So even though our hand is improved, we're no longer making a continuation bet. We're no longer bluffing. We're betting for value now, and we need to make another bet. So we do. He goes away. But you can see how if we were just making a pure C bet, this would have been a bad board to do so on. Okay, so here we're late position, 8-7 suited. It's a decent spot to go ahead and raise. Everyone has full stacks, they're pretty close. So we go ahead, we make a raise here, and we get a call from the big blind. Now he checks to us, and the board comes out, and it is a suited board. It's a connected board. Not a great spot for us to make a continuation bet. Really, we have the pair of sevens. That gives us a little bit of showdown value. And really, this board is so easy to hit his range or for him to represent things. It's not a great spot for us to see bet, even though we have equity from our gut shot draw. There's too many ways that he can either already have better or that he can continue. We should have skipped here, but I went ahead and made a bet looking at our value, and indeed our opponent check raises us. He may not have had a better hand. He may have just had a strong draw. He may have had a pretty combo draw, that sort of thing, or he may have just not believed us. We won't really know, but our hand isn't strong enough to call that bet. We have to go away. And this really would have been a spot where we should have probably skipped the bet for pot control reasons, and just take advantage of the fact that we do have, decent equity with the 7 and the fact that a 10 will give us a straight. So here with the ace jack, we have one limper. It's a decent spot to go ahead and raise it up. We're suited. The flop comes down. It's a pretty blank board, and we do have the backdoor potential for a straight or for a flush. I guess runner straight is possible too. And there's not a whole lot of reason to think that he would have much here. So this is an okay spot to see bet. We bet and he calls. That's not what we were looking for, but it doesn't always work out. The turn really hurts our hand in that it completes that flush. So a lot of the ways that he could have had, a hand just good enough to call on the flop, he's now ahead of us. So we check behind on the turn. On the river, a jack comes. That improves our hand. So when he checks, we do go ahead and bet because he has checked twice. And as it turns out, he has pocket fives. So, our value bet. It's interesting that he called there. I don't know that I would have called on the river with just pocket fives, given that the flush came in. I think a lot of the time we're going to end up with a better hand than his fives there. But it worked out for us, and it's definitely justified that we skipped the bet on the turn, and really we would have let it go if not for hitting the river. Okay, here again, late position with a 10-9 suited. That's worth raising pre-flop most of the time. We get a call from one opponent, and we have a board that comes out, and it's sort of similar to the ace 2-3 board that we had with the pocket fives, but it doesn't help any part of our hand. Here, I choose to go ahead and c-bet. He calls. This was an okay board to make the bet on. Not great because of the fact that we don't have any equity. So you could argue that it's maybe just bad enough to skip. But the fact that it is one high card, I think it's probably worth it. But we should pretty much be done at this point in the hand. 5 comes out. We check. He bets and we have to fold, and that's fine. Continuation bets don't always work, but as long as you choose your spots properly, they're going to work out often enough to make them valuable. Okay, here we have an ace queen, and we're clearly raising for value from the button. The board comes down, and it's another board that's really connected. We have the queen of clubs to help us out if we get called. Note that this is the same player that check raised us in a previous hand on a different table. So it might be enough to justify the c-bet, but since we've got that history with him, we know that on these wet boards he will like to challenge us a bit. We're going to go ahead and just check behind here. We have enough ways to improve our hand to really help us out later on, and we don't want to bloat the pot when we could improve to the best hand. So we go ahead and just check. The turn comes, it's a 7 of clubs, so that now gives us more potential to have a strong flush hit on the river. We still have the connectedness potential, so that if a 10 comes, we'll end up with the nut straight, or I guess the second nut straight if he had king queen. And he bets about half pot. So, we're sort of playing this exactly the opposite of a typical c-bet situation, in that I'm kind of saying we have enough equity to call here, and we skip the c-bet. If he had checked, we might have bet here, but as is, we're just going to go ahead and call sort of for value. We call, the river's a blank, and at this point we really have nothing, so we're just going to have to go away. But you can see there are a lot of ways for the river to improve our hand, and by not c-betting and not letting him just kind of take us off our hand, it really enabled us to realize some of our equity against part of his range. Okay, again, ace-8 suited when it's folded to us on the button, pretty easy raise. The board comes down, and it's a very connected board. All one suit. Now that's going to be a little bit scary and might get our opponent to fold, but with even a single decent club, they're going to stick around. If we had had just the ace of clubs, we'd bet here. But with no clubs, it's a spot where we definitely need to skip the bet. So we check. 5 comes out. It's not really changing anything. The board is so bad that we're just going to check it down and hope that our ace high is enough value. In the end, our kicker wins it for us. But with a board this bad, you don't want to be making bluffs. You don't want to be making those c-bets. And you can see it kind of worked out anyway, because our opponent's also not going to be inclined to bluff those boards. We're raising for value here with ace-king from early position, and we get a call from an opponent in the blinds. And then we go ahead and we skip the c-bet here on this queen-high flop. This is a spot we could have bet. We had the backdoor value. We probably would have been good to bet on the flop. And now with the jack of clubs coming, we have that now flush draw. We have the straight potential, and it's worth betting now for sure, now that he's checked to us twice. I think you could have even argued for a bet on the flop here. When he raises us, that obviously increases our question about the bet, but we had enough equity to justify calling anyway. And then with his river bet, we obviously have the second nut flush, so we're not going anywhere. We call, and it shows that he has, just a complete bluff. He was just trying to take things away from us on what he thought was a scary board, and that actually worked out to our advantage because we had that equity. Now again, we could have bet on the flop, but I chose not to. It may be that while I was at the table, I had enough of a read on this opponent to know that he's playing lots of suited and connected hands and playing back more. It's been long enough ago since I played the hand that I honestly don't remember during this review. Here with the ace-8, it's folded to us. We're betting from in position for value. We choose to skip a c-bet on this low board. This is a spot we didn't really talk that much about. Obviously, it's connected, and there are going to be a fair number of hands that he's going to think, we don't hit here, and that's sort of why we're skipping it. Even though we have the equity from a 5 giving us a potential straight, it wouldn't be the best straight, but it would probably be better than his hand. I chose to skip the bet here mostly because I want to tell a consistent story. I want my bet to sort of make sense and to sort of get that fold, because if it doesn't look like the board could have helped our hand, a lot of times it's going to increase your opponent's tendency to play back at you for those reasons too. Now the queen comes. Now we're making a sort of delayed continuation bet, even though it brings another flush draw onto the board now. That queen could help our range, and we're betting for that reason. We didn't make that c-bet on the flop, but we made a delayed bet on the turn when the turn looked more like it would make a good continuation bet card. By skipping the bet on the flop and betting the turn, it seems like that may have hit us. And that's something you can do. If you have boards that look maybe like they're questionable for making a c-bet, and you aren't sure if you want to make that bet or not, if your opponent's going to fold or not, a lot of times it's justified to go ahead and just skip the bet there on those dicey situations and look to make a continuation bet on the turn instead. Okay, so here, late position, folded to us, we raise with pocket 5s. The board comes out. It's a king jack 4 board. That's that situation where we have the connected cards that are both face cards. So our opponents are often going to hit this board enough that they want to play back at us. So we go ahead and we check. We have a little bit of equity with our pocket 5s. And frankly, if we're betting, a lot of the time he's going to end up calling and having at least as good a hand against us. So we're doing some pot control here to keep the pot small in line with our sort of small hand. And then on the turn, an ace comes, and he checks again. So here, we're faced with deciding, do we want to go ahead and just check it down, see if our 5s have enough equity, or do we want to make a play? Well, the ace is going to hit our raising range pretty well. It's kind of a scary card. It brings a flush draw that is a little, scary and has the potential for being scary on the river. And there's a lot of ways that our opponent can call here, but he has checked to us twice, and this is the type of board that he would expect us to have something on a fair number of times. So we're going to go ahead and make a bet. He does call, and then the turn brings a 10. So now there's a whole lot of ways that any hand he has here is going to be kind of scared. A lot of times we're going to have 2 pair. A fair number of times we may have, the queen with a random face card for a straight, and he's checked again to us. That's certainly in his range as well. So it's a little bit dangerous, but I think the board looks scary enough that we can bet and get folds from hands with like jacks in them, possibly hands even with kings in them, as long as he doesn't have that straight. And those are hands that we're losing to if we see a showdown. He'd also be folding, random flushes that might include a jack or a king, since they didn't get there. If he has, jack of hearts and some other card, or king of hearts and some other card that's a heart, he might fold now. So I choose to go ahead and bet again. It's a little bit more dangerous a play, but in this case, the board ran out just scary enough to justify that sort of delayed double barrel. And I think that it was a good play, even if it's a little bit dicey. With that, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up today. Hopefully this has helped you to have a better understanding of the spots that you would want to make a c-bet and the reasons for making that bet. For more poker training, subscribe to grinderschool.com and use the discount code WSOP25 to save 25% on your first subscription.